All right, those astrology girls, we have another juicy episode for you, and this time we are not joking. Like, this one's all about love, sex, relationships, how Venus and Mars come together in your chart to really tell a story and to help you understand yourself in a different way. We're unlocking all the secrets here. We want you to know how to really hone in on these aspects in your chart so that you can, one, own what you want and like live your best life in love and, you know, have all the fun you deserve and desire.
Nicole and I were like laughing before this episode because both of our husbands like are at home today because we're recording this on a weekend, and we were like joking about just all the different directions we could take this episode. And we were like, God, if they could like hear us, they might just even like have to peek their heads in the door and be like, excuse me, like, why are we talking about sex on the podcast today? Like, how deep are we going here?
Telling all of your secrets, dear, don't worry.
I'm like, but me and Nicole are like, oh, well, at least me. I'm like, so like very modest. That's my Virgo rising, kind of has this like very modest outer shell to me that I'm like, oh my gosh, like talking about sex on the podcast. Like, can I do it?
It's so funny because even though like I am a super Scorpio and these topics don't feel taboo to me, I am really private. So it's funny, even talking to Keelie before, like my friends who are in relationships and like around Mark and I, they like always think like, oh, you two have such a great bond. You've been together for so long. But like, we're not touchy-feely in public at all. Like, we are not the PDA couple. I kind of liken that to like being together when we were 16. So we were always like around parents and stuff. So we wouldn't be like rude and like disrespectful and like, you know, all over each other at 16 and 17, 18. Like, it felt just wrong. But like, that doesn't mean anything about this. I also told Keelie I have a cousin, and she calls me often. Now, she's from Taiwan, so she's really forward, and she will randomly be like, hey, how are you? You good? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, how's your sex? How's your money? Like, she believes that those two things are
how's your sex? How's your money? Like, excuse me.
Yeah, just like on a random afternoon, and you're like, okay, I'm good. Yeah, everything's fine. Everything's good. No, but really, because you know those are the most important things to get right in a relationship and stay happy.
Eighth house stuff going on in her chart.
I really need to look. I do, because she's a Cancer, so I just don't. It doesn't make sense.
She's got that eighth house stellium. Eighth house is the house of literally sex and money and the boardroom. So
yeah, she's very like right to the point about like these are the only two things that matter, and everything else will figure itself out. And I'm like, after reflecting a long time on this, I think she's actually right. It's like a great case study.
So fascinating. Yes, you guys. So today, as we've opened it up, this is what we are diving into. And really, we wanted, you know, at this point in the podcast, we've talked all about the 12 signs. We've talked about the planets. We've talked about the houses. And so now we wanted to kind of like give you guys a fun topic to that's very relevant in pretty much all of our lives, to just kind of help you understand, okay, what does astrology have to say about my love life, my sex life, and my relationship? So specifically, one of the things that we're going to be diving into first with you guys today is understanding the primary placements in your chart that can help you understand yourself in this way on a deeper level, which is Venus and Mars. Okay, so Venus as the planet, again, we did all of this in the planetary episode. So be sure to go check out episode 10 for like a much deeper dive into these planets on their own. But just kind of high level, talking about it through a relational lens, Venus represents love and affection, both how we give and receive love and affection with others. And it also is going to rule beauty, aesthetics, values, and possessions as well. So if you think about like that possession thing, like some people may tend to think of their partner as theirs, right? So that's kind of like where that possession can come into play too in relationships, and kind of like what your relationship is with your possessions and like your partner, if you see them like that. And then Mars represents your physical energy and your sexual urges and desires when it comes to your intimate relationships. So it also rules passion and drive and really how you assert yourself and pursue what it is that you want in relationships. And so ultimately the goal in this episode, just to kind of round it all together, really is to help you guys understand on a deeper level the influence of your Mars and your Venus in your birth chart and how it can help you understand your individual relationship with love, with sex, and with relationships and intimacy.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun to look at all of this, because I think that Venus and Mars, you know, they're inner planets and we look at them a lot, but I think looking at them specifically can give such a different lens. And so how do we express our Venus and our Mars? It's always through the sign. So look in your chart for the sign of your Venus and Mars. And if you want to go back and listen to episodes 2 and 3, where we go through all 12 signs in like great detail, it can give you an idea of how these are expressed. And then also our planet episode for Venus and Mars. But as Keelie just said, like, this is the focus here today. It's like love, sex, relationships, possessions, assertiveness, all of the things. But you can write down these sentences here. My Venus is in the sign of blank. I express love and affection in partnerships this way. And then write down a few of the qualities of that sign and see what rings true for you, especially the ways that you go, absolutely, that's me. And then some of the ones where you're like, oh, that's kind of me, but I'm like not sure about it, because we can unlock some stuff here for you. And then same for Mars. My Mars is in the sign of blank. My sexual urge and desires are driven by these qualities. And then write down the qualities that have the most sex appeal to you.
I love what you said too, even just that reminder that, write down as you're doing this, this is just kind of right off the bat, like as you're looking up what your Venus is in and as you're looking up what your Mars is in, this is really to just kind of like pinpoint, okay, what are some of those just like foundational, fundamental qualities that I know about these signs based on what I listened to in episodes 2 and 3, or just based on what I know about these signs in general that like really kind of stand out to me, and maybe they resonate or maybe they don't. And I love that Nicole kind of pointed that out as well, because when I first learned about my Venus placement, my Venus is in Pisces, I was like, what does this mean about me in love? Like, what does this mean about what I'm really like, looking for in a partner, and like how I'm expressing myself in relationship and in love. And I think it's just such a fascinating way for us to just kind of explore a part of ourselves that it could be polar opposite from like other areas of your chart. When we talk about like, your recipe of you being your sun, your moon, and your rising sign, episode 1. Well, this is Venus. So we're talking about like a whole other little ingredient that you're kind of like adding into this like overarching recipe of you. So this is like a little bit of like your special taste and your special ingredient in the way specifically that this recipe of you is showing up in relationship and in partnership. And so kind of feeling into, okay, when I'm in partnership, yeah, like my sun's going to show up here, my moon's going to show up here, my rising shows up here. But like when I am connected to someone and when I am expressing love to someone and when I'm expressing affection to someone, this is kind of a part of me that really shows up, and also a part of me that is like something I'm seeking in somebody else. And I just remember too, there's just so many things out in this world of like, we're all showing and expressing love in such a different way. And sometimes it's kind of like, what do I really need in a relationship? Like, what am I really looking for in this relationship? And, is this just something, Pisces is just very like fantasy. It's like the typical like hopeless romantic energy. Like you can watch a movie and you're like, that's me in relationship, like that fairy tale romance. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I can expect that. Like, I can want I don't know, like all the Piscean type of qualities to like be in relationship. And also even thinking too, I mean, when I went through my whole spiritual awakening, I'm like, oh, I really do need this kind of like spiritual component, or just to feel like connected to someone beyond just like the physical, but in a more ethereal way.
That's so interesting, because I think about my Venus in Capricorn and I watch those romantic movies with like half an eye open. I'm like, it just feels so like out there to me. Yeah, I'm like, I don't know, like, is that real? Like it just doesn't feel so resonant to me. But something I want to comment on, I feel like what we talked about in episode 1 about our sun, moon, and rising, and how you really meet that person's rising sign on the outside when you first get to know them. I think the same in connection of a relationship. Venus is kind of like the outfit you're wearing, but I think the behavior that you're meeting from someone initially is definitely their Mars sign. You're going to see how they show up and how they take action, what's their initiative like or not like in that pursuit of romance. And I think that can be really interesting to see, because you might get to know their Venus a little bit later in the game than you do upon first interaction or something. I can imagine someone with like a really bold Mars placement, maybe like me, being very forward, right? And then someone who doesn't have such a bold Mars placement being like a little bit more reserved or like waiting to be pursued or things like that. And so it can come up in so many different ways. And I wouldn't have said to myself, oh, like I don't know, my Mars placement makes sense to me. My Venus placement, I was like, boring. Like when I read about that, I was like, oh, that's like not fun. Like that's not the exciting like placement that I would want to like put on a t-shirt, you know, like my Venus is in Capricorn, you know. But like I just think it is actually a really cool placement now that I know about it and how it plays with the rest of my chart. But as I first learned about it, don't feel bad if you're like, that's not like the spicy love story I was hoping for, you know.
You know, it's so interesting as you were talking about how Venus is kind of that like first impression and just kind of like, I mean, it is, it's like kind of our aesthetics and our beauty, but also just kind of like what we're really like even like looking for on the surface. But what's so interesting, like as we know, Pisces being the super ethereal, mystical sign, it's so interesting because there's this thing I have with like people's eyes. Like there are few people, Ryan was one of them, and then certain friends and just people in my life that like when I locked eyes with them for the first time, it's like I will never forget that moment. And it's almost like there was something in the eyes. It was like on this like deeper spiritual level. And it's like same thing with Ryan. I don't think he remembers the first time like he saw me, but like I vividly remember being in high school, seeing him walk through the room for the very first time. And this has never happened with anyone else. And I was like, oh my God, that guy. Like, and it's just so interesting because like I just have this like it's spiritual moments that I like have with people where it's like, you don't know what it is. You don't know why you're having this like moment that like, I'm just having myself with this person. Like, this is like an interesting person. Like there's something about this person here, or there's some connection that I have with them that I don't understand. And I'm like, this is totally my Venus and Pisces.
Yeah, the way you described that was like a movie. Like, you know, I can imagine it like everything getting still and you just like zoom, like, oh my gosh, this is a moment. Like, it just sounds like a movie when you talk about it.
Ryan, I'm like, do you remember the first time you saw me? And he's like, of course I do. And I'm like, well, then describe it. I'm like, because I remember you, like, your blonde, flowy hair, like, walking through the door. And I'm like, oh my God.
You're like, tell me in great detail everything you remember. And he's like, yeah, I saw you. You were there. Present. I know guys have a different way of remembering things, and I feel like even if Mark did remember like those exact moments, he would describe it like very normally. Like, yep, you were in homeroom with me. Our last names were close in letter.
It's so funny.
So romantic.
Okay, so we want to kind of dive into the specifics, a little bit more of like the specifics of Venus as it shows up relationally, as well as like Mars as it shows up in relationally. We're also going to get a little bit into the houses here in a bit. So we're not just talking about Venus and Mars, but these are really prominent placements in your chart. And this is where we wanted to kick us off with today, because these really help you understand these aspects of you and how they're showing up. So just kind of starting with Venus, okay, the sign of your Venus. Venus is going to show you your seductive, your sensual, your affectionate, and your romantic side. It represents how you express affection and how you show up in love. It helps you understand like what you value in relationships as well, and also in life. So for me, like that spiritual component, super important for me, like in relationships. Not that my partner is even like woo-woo, but like there's just something like beneath the surface that you're connected with, that it's like something that's even like unspoken for me. Like I really resonate with that, having that like spiritual component in relationships, and something I really value, and it's important to me in life as well. And then, you know, Venus is also your approach to like how you connect, the way that you harmonize with others, and also like your self-worth and how you feel about yourself in relationship with others. So some of the key things for you guys to think about as you're sitting with, okay, here's my Venus, here's the sign of my Venus. Think about, what do I need to feel loved? What do I need to feel loved? How do I show affection to others? Okay, what are some of the qualities that I'm looking for in a partner? And then like, what's my love language, right? So all of these things right here can help you kind of deepen into some of these questions, think about them, to help you deepen into your specific sign of your Venus. And so Nicole and I, we're not necessarily going to dive into like every single sign by Venus placement today and by Mars placement, but we do want to speak just kind of from like a general perspective through the elements, because even understanding what element your Venus and Mars placement is, like whether it's in fire, air, earth, or water, is going to help you understand a lot just about this part of you, you know, on this like overarching level. So really quickly, if you've got Venus and fire in a fire sign of Aries, Leo, or Sag, that's going to show up in a more passionate, bold, and adventurous kind of love. If you've got Venus in the earth sign of Taurus, Virgo, or Capricorn, think a little bit more practically, the sensual, like the five senses, like the touch, the taste, the smell, the feel. And then also stability, right? It's very earthy, it's very grounded, it's very rooted, it's very like three-dimensional, you can touch and feel it type of thing. Now, a Venus in an air sign, think like intellectual communication, like having spaciousness, like the air, it's vast, it's, you can't lock it in. So air signs kind of are seeking like kind of that freedom, that spaciousness in relationships, perhaps. And then a water Venus in the sign of Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, that's going to be maybe a little bit more of like an emotional experience, a more intuitive experience, like wanting to have this like deep feeling connection with a partner through your Venus. So overall, things you can reflect on through that is like, okay, so knowing like the element and the sign of your Venus, what does that say about your love style? And then how does that resonate right now with like your current relationships or some of your past relationships?
I love this description, especially of the earth signs, because I think of even myself with my earth Venus, and I'm just like, I'm a very practical, even in relationship with friends, like very solid, stable, practical friend. Like, you come to my house and like, oh, do you want to take this with you? Like, I'm just like, I'll literally, someone's like, oh, I love that vase. And I'm like, here, you can have it. And it's like very 3D, like normal stuff. It's not this deep ooey gooey love, but I'm like, I want to make sure you're solid and feeling really good. And so that Venus expression can show up in so many different ways when you really start to deepen your experience with it and just like look into it from different angles. Okay, now we're going to take it to Mars, which is a completely different expression. So Mars shows your hot, steamy, passionate lovemaking side, and it represents our drive and motivation in relationships, how we assert ourselves, how do we handle conflict, the type of passion and physical connection we crave. So, key questions for this: what ignites my passion? Now, if these questions feel uncomfortable, I really encourage you to get closer to your Mars sign and just really just like let it go. You can journal this, you can burn it later, do whatever you want, but just really think about this. How do I go after what I want in love? How do I handle conflict in relationships? So now, breaking it down by element, fire, earth, air, and water, you can figure out even more about these signs. So if you've got Mars in a fire sign, Aries, Leo, or Sagittarius, you're bold, dynamic, and you thrive on excitement. Earth Mars, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, steady, sensual, you really value reliability. Aries Mars, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, you're playful, you're communicative, mentally stimulated. These are keywords that you can really think of for all these signs. Now, water Mars, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, deeply emotional, intuitive, and passionate. So when we look at that and you can kind of get the flavor and you can see they're similar to that of Venus, but they're going to express differently because it's not just about how you express affection, but it's going after what you want. It's that passion, it's that urge, it's that desire. Reflect. What does your Mars placement have to say about your sexual urges and passionate side? And how does your Mars energy show up in intimacy and connection? I was talking to Keelie before this episode and I was like, I wish that a lot of women would just kind of like go after what they want in relationships. And I'm very driven by my Mars and Scorpio. Like, I think that we should not play the game of like, well, maybe he likes me, maybe he doesn't, right? And this goes for everyone. I think this not just women, but I find that a lot of time women are careful about how much they lead on to men. And it's not that you have to be like so forward, like marry me, like let's get together and build a farm. But you could be like, hey, do you want to hang out or do you want to get together? And I know that a lot of people feel really strongly about like, no, I must be pursued as a woman. And I'm like, hey, listen, you do you. But I think that men are often more afraid of rejection than women. And so when we can give the man the safety signal that says, hey, by the way, like, I will likely say yes if you ask me to go get coffee without being weird about it, then they're more likely to feel confident to ask you. And I think that sometimes that comes in really handy so that you're not waiting around. Like, is he going to ask me on a date or whatever? But like, kind of be like, so I'm available next Thursday if you want to hang out. And I just think that could be a really cool way to play with your Mars placement, especially if you feel like saying that would send you into a panic attack. It could be a really fun experiment.
Wait, okay, so your Mars is in Scorpio?
Yes.
Nicole. That is like, I feel like the ultimate sex placement.
Oh God, here we go.
Okay, but like really, like Scorpio is the most sexual of the signs. And I'm like, to have the planet of sexual urges and desires in the sign of sex, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's like, oh, and here I am going, just text him, just say you're interested. Like, meanwhile, I'm like, I really feel like my life would be so different if I wasn't in a long-term relationship. Because of this, like, I would probably be like a very dating person, but my Venus is in Capricorn, and so everything pointed against being like a serial dater. You know, it was like,
Yes.
actually, this forward sexual sign wants to just like lock it in and be done for life, you know?
Yeah, because Capricorn is like long-term goals. It is like that long-term committed energy. And so it's like so fascinating, like your Venus being in Capricorn. Like that definitely, it's so interesting when we look at our Venus and our Mars, it like literally tells our love story. It's like, not to like dissect you here, but I'm like, no, that Capricorn Venus of yours in love and in relationship seeks that like long-term committed partnership. It is like, I mean, it is not necessarily dating for fun. And then that Mars in Scorpio is like, oh, we're taking our relationship to the deep of the depths that we can go as like souls here.
Yeah, get your
Not
air
to
tank
call
ready.
you out, but like I'm like, that's so fascinating.
It is, and it's so funny because if you listen to episode 6, As Your Partner Is Woo Woo As You, Keelie said like she was really attracted to her partner because they had so much fun together. They really had this great, fun relationship, and I thought that was so sweet. But I like in my mind, like my thought was like, what drew Mark and I together? And it was just like this deep soul obsession. And it just makes a lot of sense because of my Mars and Scorpio. And then we're together forever now. So it works out that legacy building, you know, Capricorn Venus, like wanting to be safe, solid, stable. Like that's exactly what we did. So
Yeah, when I think about my Mars is like, I feel like complete opposite than yours.
you're like, wow, totally different.
So it's funny. My Mars is in Gemini. And as I was thinking about this, you know, Gemini being this air sign, like one, when you think about, not to like give away like, you know, who I am on like this sexual way, but like I am very attracted to somebody else's mind. Like I will say that, like somebody else's mind, like if I can have a powerful, good conversation with them and like, I'm attracted to intellect. Like, and it's so interesting to just like notice that. I would also, so my Mars being in Gemini, I think like that intellect, that like stimulation of the mind, I'm like, yes, feed me more, like keep me entertained here. And then Nicole and I were also laughing because I was telling her before, I was like, I feel like they have, like, when I was in my dating days, which was a long time ago, because I've been with my husband a long time, I was like, they had to be a good texter. Like, they had to be somebody who could, like, keep a conversation, like, one-word responses, or just people who, like, didn't know how to keep a good conversation in text. I'm like, no. Like, I need to be, like, intellectually stimulated. Not that they had to talk to me all the time either, because that Gemini Mars of mine loved to play games. Like, it is a game player, a flirty flirt, like... I mean, Nicole's like, no, we're not here to play games. Like, this is the real deal. And I'm like, if you come off too forward, I'm gone. I'm bye. Like,
that is like, so funny.
You've got to keep me more interested than that. I was definitely a game player back in my dating days.
I love that. I love that admission of a Gemini Mars of like, you know what? There were games played and I had fun. I had fun with them. I've also heard people reflect on Gemini, you know, Venus, and kind of like they talk a big game, like big flirts, but then like you get together with them and they're kind of just like reserved. They're like, whatever. Like, it's not as fun as like playing as the chase, you know, of getting to the date. Meanwhile, my Scorpio Mars is like, oh, we can talk, but like, why don't we hang out? Like, let's do something. Let's hang out together. And I'm like, might as well just kiss me. Like, it's fine.
Well, I'm also thinking too, both my Venus and my Mars are in mutable placements. And it was no wonder I'm very flighty. Like in relationships, I'm like, woo, like we've been together 2 months. Bye. Like,
yeah, you've been married for so long.
Well, you know, with Ryan, it's like once we locked it in, we locked it in. But even so, like, I mean, I've been with him longer than any of my friends. I was the very last one to get married because I was like, the commitment, you know, I'm like, okay, you know, but that's, you know, Mars and Gemini, again, Gemini and Pisces, it's just their mutable placements, and Mars is wishy-washy, or Gemini's, okay, I won't say wishy-washy. You called me out on that last time.
I was like, people might be like, oh no, that's offensive.
Well, I can call myself wishy-washy because I feel like that. But there can be a lot of indecisiveness like with those. And so, yeah, I think there's just so much for us to explore with these placements. And I mean, gosh, like I'm still exploring like these parts of myself, years and years after even learning about them in the first place. But it really can be so just fun and fascinating to just start to just explore these parts of yourself and like, okay, well, like, what does this say about my sexual urges and my sexual desires? And yeah,
And there's nothing wrong with that, says the Scorpio. I'm like, nothing wrong with any of this. Also, tell me you're from Texas without telling me you're from Texas. You're like, I was the last one of all my friends to get married. Like, how old were you, Keelie?
Yeah, that's actually really funny. Yeah. What was I, like 28?
Okay, it's not that late.
28, yeah.
Yeah, but in Texas, you're like off the market. Like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That cracks me up. I'm an East Coast girl, so it's like 30, 35 marriages were like normal.
Yeah, tell me you're from Texas without telling me. Yeah, exactly. All my friends were married, like, got out of college. Like,
wow, committed from the get-go. Maybe they have some strong Scorpio placements as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, man. Well, we're going to talk about house influences here. So, like, how do the houses bring even more depth to this? Now, we're not going to talk about every house because not every house has, like, this meaning for what we're discussing here. But, like, other love, sex, and relationship influences in the chart are primarily noted as the 5th, 7th, and the 8th house. So, the 7th house is obvious for most people because it is the house of relationships with others. It's the most important house when it comes to how you relate to others, specifically in marital partnerships, because marital partnerships are considered contracts. So it's like a legally binding type of relationship. It also does like business relationships and like one-to-one, but for this purpose, marital. So the sign that occupies your 7th house gives you clues into the kind of energy you're seeking in a marital partnership. And your 7th house is completely opposite of your ascendant. So if you're looking at them, they're like on opposite ends of each other. And they often say, like, that's why opposites attract. So if you have Venus or Mars in the 7th house, it can mean that you find enjoyment being in a committed relationship. And that makes a lot of sense. But think of that. Any planets you have in the 1st and the 7th house could lend that way of like how you have a relationship with yourself and others, and especially Venus and Mars.
Yeah. Yeah. When it comes to you wanting to understand yourself better as it relates to marriage and like that area of life, that really is like the 7th house, which is why I love astrology too. It's like we can just understand like ourselves so much more through this. And, going back to like when we talk about the rising sign, our ascendant, as Nicole said, like the rising sign, our ascendant marking the 1st house is complete opposite of the 7th house, right? So like those energies have this opposite polarity to them. So if you think about it, like someone who has, for example, like a Virgo rising like myself, you're going to have all of the personality traits of that Virgo energy, of that Virgo rising, right? But for example, in my closest relationships, I'm looking at what is the sign completely opposite of Virgo, okay, on the 7th house. Well, for me, that's Pisces. And so that Pisces energy, that Piscean energy is going to be what is actually most present for me in relationships. So while, yes, I'm showing up as a Virgo rising, those are my personality traits. That's who I am, to the world, especially on this like first impression basis. That's like my skill set, like the individual me, but in partnership, part of me that comes out is actually the Pisces. And that's even if I didn't have any planets. I have my moon and my Venus in Pisces. But even if I didn't have any planets in there, just knowing that like Pisces is the sign occupying my 7th house, it's the sign on the 7th house, that would tell me how I'm showing up in relationship and also like what I'm seeking out in relationship too. So it's not necessarily like, yes, Venus can tell you a lot about like that aspect of you, okay? And like how it's showing up in relationship and what it's seeking in love, but also that 7th house is really helping you understand the qualities that you're seeking out, like in that marital partnership and like who you are, like the part of you that just kind of comes out in the same way that like your rising sign qualities come out. This part of you kind of comes out in partnership.
That makes a lot of sense for me for my Taurus 7th house, like of like the qualities I'm seeking out in a relationship are so stable, so grounded. You know, I need someone stacking that cash to the ceiling. I just love that. That makes me so happy to feel provided for and grounded and earthy. So I always love that part of the descendant because I feel like it's a mystery type placement for a lot of people who are just starting to study astrology. They're like, okay, the 7th house relationships, like, where's my partner? And it's like, not necessarily. It's like, we have to think of these as qualities. And it really makes a lot of sense when we can dive into that and express differently.
Yeah. Well, and even thinking too, you know, like what's so interesting is, yes, you're looking for example, like I'm looking for that Pisces energy in a marital partnership. And like Ryan is actually a Pisces rising, you know? And so it's like when you flip flop them like that, like it's actually a lot of times like what I'm seeking in partnership is kind of like what you're getting from the person on the surface. So like a lot of times there can be this kind of just theory that like a lot of people find themselves with the opposite, like whatever you have on your descendant line could be that partner's rising sign and vice versa. Like Ryan is seeking out Virgo in his partnership. And I'm that Virgo rising for him, which is really just like cool to think about in that way. But also I was thinking too, like your Taurus descendant is so complementary to your Venus and Capricorn because they're both earthy. And like, as you're describing, like the Taurus, like really seeking, you know, that stability in that way, that's so complementary to Capricorn.
And I have Venus in the 2nd house, which is the traditional house of Taurus. So it's just like a double stack of that same energy. And I even discovered too, looking at Mark's chart recently, that my moon is conjunct his descendant. So it just plays together really beautifully. It shows you all that you don't need to know everything about your partner. You might discover it 18 years later and you're like, wow, look at this. We're so great. We're so great together.
Well, and even too, like, yeah, if you're in a partnership right now with someone and you want to understand like how your, you know, recipe of love language relates to like their recipe of love language, go look up their Venus and Mars. It's so interesting too, because Ryan has his Mars in Gemini too. And I'm like, oh, we're really compatible in that way too. Which is so interesting. I feel like there's so many like deeper things I could say. And I'm like, not on the podcast.
Have you ever done, and you don't have to answer this, but have you ever done the love language test together?
Like what our love languages are?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, yes.
And did they match up?
We know ours.
You know them.
They don't match up.
Oh. Mark and I thought we would totally be different, and we shocked ourselves.
Well, I think, you know, Ryan, I think maybe that's like also a Venus thing too. And like my Venus being in Pisces, like I definitely am an acts of service love language. And I see that a lot with like my Virgo rising. And also I think my Pisces Venus is super compassionate and wants to like be of service. That's such a quality of like Pisces. And his Venus is in Sag. He's definitely like a words of affirmation and also physical touch. So it's like, it's interesting. We show love in different ways. Or like we have different love languages that we default to.
I love that.
So it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean,
match each other's love languages.
What good thing doesn't take a lot of work? And sometimes it doesn't feel like work. It just feels like adaptation and just like being mutable, you know, and all of that. Mark and I took the quiz and like before we went in and we were totally like, okay, Nicole's is totally going to be acts of service. It's like, I love when he does things for me. I'm like, oh, that's so nice. Like, this is the best ever. No, we were completely wrong. The quiz shocked us because we both ended up with the same top 2 and it was physical touch and gifts.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, we're the people that like don't do gifts for a lot of things. And we're like, how are we defined? Do we need to be better at gift giving? Because we're like, this is so funny that we both came up, like, those two were very high. And so acts of service were next for me, obviously, because I really do appreciate, like, oh, I fixed that light bulb. You know, I'm like, oh, that's so nice. Thank you. You know, I really appreciate that. But I think that, like, love language can tell you a lot. And then see how it relates to your Venus and your Mars placements and see if you can find any threads. Obviously, I don't think that book was written with your astrology in mind, but you know, conditioning of the 3D world can really get to us. And so that's probably where the love language comes in a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super fascinating. And I want to say too that like knowing Ryan's Venus is in Sag and my Venus is in Pisces, like, yeah, there are some things in our charts that like make sense relationally. And then also there's things like that where I'm like, that's like a lot of different. Guess what water does to fire? Water puts out fire, right? Or like fire overpowers the water. And so, like understanding that about our Venuses, now we can understand, okay, what do we need, and how we're seeking out love from one another and how we can show affection to one another. And this is why astrology can be really powerful. Oh, like we've got kind of a fundamental difference in how we're like showing each other love. And this is like part of a relationship that's going to take work.
Yeah, I think Mark has Venus in Sag as well. And I just think that my Scorpio Mars overplays that and makes it work, because my Venus in Capricorn certainly does not match up with a Venus in Sag at all. They're just very different. And his Mars is in Libra. And so we've just got a very interesting elemental balance going on. All four, actually. How fun. And how weird as well.
Okay, so moving on to the fifth house. The fifth house is going to be the house of love affairs. So seventh house, house of like the contractual marital partnership. Now we're kind of like going back a couple of houses to the fifth house. Now this is one of the houses of sex, but it's more of like fun, casual, like dating kind of sex, right? Like you're not married yet and like merging with the other, which we'll get to that house in a minute. But this is more lighter, fun, playful. It's kind of like, how are you showing up in dating? Like, what's your relationship with love affairs and having just kind of like some of that casual relationships with others that you're getting to know, and like how you're experiencing them and what the fifth house has to tell you about just that area of your life specifically. So the sign of the fifth house is going to really help you understand your attitude towards all affairs of love. It's going to be that unmarried kind of like exploratory kind of love. Again, it's like really like the house of fun and the house of play. So thinking about like, how do you guys date? Right? Like understanding the sign of the fifth house is going to help you understand how you maybe date and like what's your relationship perhaps with like the more casual kind of sex. What's so interesting is my fifth house, when I was like thinking about this, I'm like, well, I've got Capricorn on my fifth house. So Capricorn actually is like no casual dating for me. Like I am like in it to like for the long haul. Like if I'm dating you, I'm serious about you. And that's really interesting to think about too. Granted, I didn't really like date much in like my adult years, and that kind of explains why. It's like I found my person and we were like in it forever.
Yeah, that's a really great point about Capricorn. Capricorn's like, nope, we're done. That's not gonna happen.
We're not gonna have fun with this. Like it's so funny because yeah, fifth house being like the house of like fun and play and all the things, and Capricorn's like, I'm so serious. Plus I got Saturn in there, which makes it even way more serious. So I take dating very seriously, you guys.
Listen, it's all where you're showing up to class to get those good marks from Saturn. You've got it. You've got it on lock.
Yeah. So anyways, okay. So this house is also, just wanted to point out, this house is also the house of children. So it involves like the procreative act of having children, right? So like that lovemaking act. And if you are someone that has Venus or Mars in your fifth house, then it can mean that you have a really fun and playful attitude around love and sex. What's your relationship with the fifth house, Nicole?
I have my moon in the fifth house, and so I've got Aries there, and I think it's just very forward.
Totally. It explains why when you're dating, you've got that Aries, like, I'm just going straight to the question of like, let's go out.
Yeah, because I find like when people are like, what should I say back to this guy? And I tell them, and they're like, I would literally die if I said that. And I'm like, oh, okay, like I didn't know it was that serious. So yeah, I think the forwardness of the fifth house for me really makes sense. And I'm just like right to the point. Like there's no, life is too short to wait and to mess around. So like, let's just go for it, and like have a good time. Obviously, I've been in a very, very long relationship. So my relationship with casual sex is non-existent because I wasn't an adult in my dating life. And so to me, I don't know, but maybe in another life that was big for me. Who knows with that fifth house.
Well, I would say though that Venus and Capricorn is like, it takes love seriously too. It's like, yeah, it's like I'm playing the long game here, So, and I think all these parts, it's like I sit here and say, like my fifth house and Capricorn says kind of a lot about like, my dating life, but also I've got that Mars and Gemini that's also like really like flirty and a little bit flighty in relationship. But when it comes down to actually being in a relationship, it's like, and perhaps that's where it came from. It's like, yeah, you're not the it person, bye. You're not the it person, bye. And then once my, I did find the it person, Ryan, it's like, okay, I'm in the long game. Like, this isn't for fun. Like, we're doing this.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing when you can find that person you just know. You're like, oh, good, you know? And it happened for Keely and I really early, but I believe that most people will eventually have that moment, you know, where you find that person and you'll just know. And so when it happens, you will remember. And it'll be like, hopefully, it'll be that Pisces movie-esque romantic moment where you're just
Only,
like, this is
only
it.
if you're a Pisces, Venus, or, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, because I feel like other people, like you said, it's like, ugh, what is that?
Yeah, back in the day, Mark and I, we had texting, of course, because we're not like ancient, but it wasn't as popular as it is now. And so we would write each other notes. And, as sentimental as Capricorn can be, I kept them. So did Mark. And we read them before our wedding and we were like so blown away, like how clearly like solid and in love we were at that point. But it wasn't corny. It was just like you could tell by the like little notes we would write each other, like we were in it, like we were so committed.
Love letters, I feel like it's totally like that Scorpio, like Mars, like I'm gonna like express my love to you so deeply. Like they're not corny, like I think I like you, check yes or no, but like
yeah, like
no, like I love your soul and let me stare into your eyes and all the Scorpio stuff.
I know they're so deep that I'm like, oh my god, do we need to make sure like one day someone like burns these if we die so like our kids don't find them and are like, ew. That could be
so cute. I love that.
We're like, anybody reading these could be detrimental to our reputation, so we must get rid of them. It's really interesting. It's so fun to think about that, like, whole journey as it's gone on in life. But, we talked about the fifth house. Now, fifth house is... I also do want to say about the fifth house, when we say love affairs, we don't necessarily mean like cheating on a spouse.
Although it literally could mean that.
It could mean that. And so, take that with what you will, but it's not only that. Because when I hear the word affair, I'm like, oh my god, affair, that's so tragic. Like, that would be so terrible. But it's like, it's more than that.
No, yeah.
But the eighth house, if the fifth house is kind of like the open, casual sexual relationship, the eighth house is definitely like the house of deep sexual expression and intimacy. This is behind closed doors. Like, nobody really knows this about you besides your partner. Like, the house where two become one. So Scorpio, if I've ever heard it. Not in a contractual way like the seventh house, but this is like on a soul, sexual, merging, intimate kind of way. Like when people say like, I don't know, the Kundalini rising, like this is what I think of, like eighth house vibe, It is the complete bond between two people. And so if you have Venus or Mars in the eighth, it can mean that there's an intensity and depth that happens in the bedroom in your attitude towards sex or wherever. It doesn't have to be in the bedroom, but get some curtains, people, right? Like keep your eighth house private, okay? Like this is the time where you are just together in that relationship, and this is like the sacred sanctuary of your love and deep expression.
See, I don't have any planets in my eighth house. Eighth house feels so foreign to me, honestly. I'm like, it's so deep, and my Aquarius wants to live on the surface, and then my Pisces is just so ethereal, like living in the fantasy world. But I've got Aries in my eighth house. Like, and I'm like so cute. I'm like trying to think about how that shows up.
Yeah,
you're my Aries friend. You should just tell me.
Well, I think like having Aries in the eighth just means like, yeah, there's like a boldness to that, and there's like a initiative that comes with that, but it might not have that big of a weight for you. And so anyone else listening to this going like, oh, like, well, I don't have eighth house planets, or I don't have anything in the eighth house. Well, like then next thing to look at is like, what planets or aspects do you have in Scorpio? Because Scorpio is the ruler of the eighth house. And so those two things can come together. But yeah, I don't know that it necessarily has anything to mean about that, but maybe you just are like, whoosh, like right out of the gate, like, okay, go. Like, I'm not going to worry about this. Like that Aries attitude of being fast, bold, the first, and then also the Aquarian surface level, like, no, I'm not going to worry about this. Like, it just kind of all comes together. Just because you don't have any, not you, Keely, but just because you don't have any eighth house placements or anything doesn't mean that you're like bad in the bedroom, right? Like, people would be like, oh my God, is that? People would say like, oh, I don't have second house placements, does that mean I'm going to be poor? It's like, no, it doesn't mean that. It just might not be the focus of your life,
Well, and I will add to that like, if you were wanting to gain some insight into like still the aspect of you that is like ruling the eighth house, like for me, Aries is in my eighth house. And so I would look at the planetary ruler of Aries to see, to gain more insight into like that eighth house and like where that part of me is like where that eighth house is kind of showing up in my life, right? So for me, Aries, and this is a little bit more advanced, and we'll get to these topics later, but just to kind of give you a point, like the ruler of Aries is the planet Mars. So I would go look at what Mars is doing in my chart to gain a better understanding of like, okay, well, Mars is in my ninth house. And so, maybe like feeling into that house and how that house and that area of life maybe does, have something to say or a story to tell around my relationship with like all the taboos of the eighth house.
Actually, thinking about this with your Mars and Gemini in the ninth house makes so much sense as to why you're so like intellectually connected that to people. Like you're like, oh, this is the thing for me. It's like, of course, the ninth house, the house of the higher mind. Like,
Yeah.
love this for you. Just love it. When it makes sense, it just makes sense so good. Like when you had your realization about my Scorpio Mars, I'm like, this is my version for you. I'm like, duh.
Yeah. So you guys, we hope that you guys found this episode supportive and just really helpful in understanding yourself in this way. And hopefully too, by me and Nicole sharing a little bit of our stories, like it gave you just kind of some insight into how you can start thinking about your chart and like these aspects of you a little bit more too.
Yeah, for sure. As we said at the top, sex and money, two of the most important things ever, according to my cousin. Maybe we'll have to do a whole episode on money next so that we can bring all this together. But the way we show up in love and relationships and even in sex is just so important. It is part of who we are. It is the fiber of our being. We need connection. We need intimacy. We need love. And so don't feel shameful or taboo about these topics. And if you do, it's an invitation to look at why. I feel like so many people have been told like that's wrong or we should be super private about these things. And yeah, eighth house vibes. You can keep that all very private, but don't feel shame about it. Just live your life. And, this episode's going to come out in a time of love, in February. But if you're listening to it in the future, just know that these topics ring true 365, at least in my world.
Love it. This was so good. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We hope you all really enjoyed this episode. And if you've got some friends that you think would really like benefit from learning about their Venus and their Mars and, the houses of love, sex, and relationship, like we'd love for you to share this episode with them and those Astrology Girls podcasts with them. Thank you guys so much for being here. We love having you guys along this journey with us, tuning in week after week. And if you guys are enjoying it, then we invite you to rate and review the podcast. It always supports us. And we will see you guys again next week. Bye.
See you soon.